Waterloo. Napoleon's empire crumbles in one day. The spring of 1815 carried a strange stillness across Europe. It was the calm after a tempest that had raged for over a decade. Towns and cities from Lisbon to Moscow had been scorched by war, redrawn by diplomacy, and exhausted by revolution. Peace, however tentative, had returned. Monarchs reclined once again on gilded thrones. The old world breathed a sigh of relief. And then, like thunder on a clear day, came the word. Napoleon had returned. He had escaped exile on the rocky island of Elba, slipped past British patrols, and marched triumphantly through France, not as a fugitive, but as an emperor reborn. Entire regiments sent to arrest him laid down their arms and joined his cause. Within weeks, the tricolor flew once more over the Tuileries Palace. The 100 Days had begun. Europe, shocked by the audacity, acted with rare unity. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, longtime allies in war but wary of each other in peace, now reassembled the Seventh Coalition. Their mission was clear: end Napoleon's reign before it could ignite a second conflagration. But Napoleon did not wait for the storm to gather. He knew time was against him. France was tired. The army, though fiercely loyal, had been stretched thin. Supplies were short. Diplomacy was dead. There was only one path left: strike first, strike fast, divide and conquer. He turned his gaze north, where two coalition armies loomed: the British-led Anglo-Allied force under the Duke of Wellington, and the Prussian army commanded by the relentless Field Marshal Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher. Napoleon's plan was as daring as it was familiar: drive a wedge between his enemies and defeat them in detail before they could unite. He had done it before, against the Austrians at Ulm, against the Russians at Austerlitz, against the Prussians at Jena. But this was not 1805, and the man commanding the opposing force at Waterloo was no amateur. Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, was not a charismatic firebrand. He was precise, calculating, and deeply methodical. He did not win battles through drama, but through structure, through reading terrain like scripture, through anticipating the enemy's habits, and through cold, enduring patience. And while he had never faced Napoleon himself, his campaigns in Spain had forged a hardened, disciplined army that had beaten some of France's finest. On the other flank stood Blücher, decades older and driven by iron resolve. He had tasted defeat at Napoleon's hands before, but his will had not broken. His army was fast-moving, stubborn, and burning with revenge. Between them, a trap was forming. Napoleon saw it, but believed he could break it. By June 15th, he crossed the Belgian frontier with 124,000 men. The old machine was in motion again. Veterans of Austerlitz, Borodino, and Dresden marched alongside fresh recruits drawn from a country that still remembered the glory days. Their emperor rode at the head, familiar bicorn hat, gray coat flapping in the wind. The days that followed would be swift and brutal. Skirmishes at Charleroi, clashes at Quatre Bras, a brutal struggle at Ligny, where Napoleon crushed part of the Prussian force, but not decisively enough. And then came June 18th, 1815, a ridge near the small Belgian village of Waterloo. Rain soaked the fields. The sky hung low. The fate of Europe would be decided in a single day. But even before the cannons fired, something felt different. This was no longer the Napoleon of Marengo or Austerlitz. The man who had once danced across maps like a master strategist now looked over his shoulder more often than ahead. His enemies, once fractured and slow, had learned, adapted, hardened. Europe, once cowed by his genius, had grown immune to the shock. Yet the French army still believed. And so, as dawn broke and the wet fields began to dry under a hesitant sun, both sides prepared. One side to defend the fragile peace of a continent, the other to resurrect an empire. The world held its breath. Waterloo was about to begin. The night of June 17th was thick with tension and rain. A torrential downpour had turned the rolling Belgian countryside into mud and mire. Horses struggled to keep footing. Gun carriages sank into the ground. Officers shouted over the storm. Beneath makeshift tents, thousands of soldiers lay sleepless, not from fear, but from cold, discomfort, and the knowledge that tomorrow would demand everything. Napoleon himself rested near the farmhouse of Le Caillou, reviewing reports by candlelight. He was calm, too calm perhaps. There had been signs. He had misjudged the tenacity of the Prussians at Ligny. He had sent Marshal Grouchy in pursuit, expecting him to pin down Blücher and prevent the Prussians from regrouping with Wellington. It was a sound strategy, on paper, but paper doesn't factor in momentum. And momentum, that old ally of Napoleon, was beginning to waver. Across the battlefield, the Duke of Wellington had established his line on the Mont Saint Jean ridge, just south of the village of Waterloo. His position was chosen with methodical care. The ridge provided natural elevation. Behind it, roads led to Brussels, his lifeline and fallback. In front of it, 3 key strongpoints would anchor his defense: the fortified farms of Hougoumont, La Haye-Sainte, and Papelotte. These were not just geographical dots. They were the hinges on which the battle would turn. Wellington had learned from years of war in the Iberian Peninsula. He knew how to fight a superior force. He trusted in reverse slope tactics, positioning his troops behind the crest of the ridge where they would be shielded from artillery and could rise only when the enemy was close. He was not there to conquer, but to hold, to delay, to give the Prussians time to rejoin him. It was not just a tactical decision, it was psychological warfare. Wellington wanted Napoleon to feel the urgency, to commit early, to misstep. As dawn approached on June 18th, Napoleon believed he had caught the British alone. Grouchy, though lagging, would surely delay Blücher. Wellington would have to stand and fight, and Napoleon would do what he had always done: strike, shatter, pursue. But he was no longer operating in the same landscape, militarily or politically. The battlefield was wet, soft, unforgiving. His artillery, the pride of the Grande Armée, would have to wait for the ground to dry. The morning's precious hours ticked away as guns were repositioned and cavalry hooves trampled the field to flatten the mud. Each hour gave the Prussians more time to close in, yet the emperor hesitated. He was fighting not just armies but ghosts, ghosts of past triumphs that made present reality feel smaller, ghosts of fatigue, illness, and indecision. And yet, he was still Napoleon. His men still looked to him as the one constant in chaos. His old guard, veterans of every major campaign since the Revolution, stood ready. The younger troops, brave but less tested, burned with belief. Wellington, too, was under pressure. Though outwardly composed, he knew his position was precarious. Many of his troops were Dutch-Belgian conscripts, untested in the field. He would need to rely heavily on his hardened British infantry, the famed redcoats who had bled in Spain and held the line at Vitoria and Salamanca. He placed his trust in their discipline and in his own ability to read the flow of battle like a chessboard. And then there was the question looming over both commanders like thunderclouds: would the Prussians arrive in time? Wellington's entire defensive strategy depended on that question. Blücher had promised support, but communication was thin, the terrain challenging, and Grouchy's forces still a wild card. Napoleon, meanwhile, believed Grouchy would hold the Prussians at bay. He had 30,000 men under his command. That should be enough. It was a classic miscalculation. In that moment, both sides were bracing for a collision, but only one fully understood what was at stake. For Wellington and Blücher, this battle was about the future of Europe. For Napoleon, it was personal. A grasp at redemption, a chance to rewrite the ending. He had gambled everything once again on the power of boldness. By mid-morning, as the sun emerged hesitantly over the battlefield, Napoleon gave the order. The drums rolled, the cavalry stirred, the infantry aligned. The Battle of Waterloo had begun, not just as a clash of armies, but as a confrontation between memory and reality, between ambition and endurance, between a fading empire and a coalition desperate to end it once and for all. The cannon would soon speak, but for now, the world still held its breath. The battle began not with a grand charge or a sweeping maneuver, but with a gate. At around 11:30 a.m., after hours of waiting for the sodden fields to dry, Napoleon gave his first command, Assault Hougoumont. On the map, it seemed a minor point, a walled farmhouse on the Allied right flank, guarded by a relatively small contingent of British and German troops. But tactically, it was a critical anchor. Napoleon didn't intend to take Hougoumont outright. His plan was simpler: launch a heavy feint there, force Wellington to commit reserves to his right, and then strike the weakened center. It was a familiar maneuver, one he had used before with success. But Hougoumont was no ordinary target. Wellington had fortified it carefully, stationing inside a composite force. Elite British Guards, Hanoverians, and Nassau troops, all under the command of officers who knew they were not just holding a farm. They were holding the key to the entire right flank. The initial French assault began with light skirmishing. Voltigeurs advanced under cover, probing the orchard and outbuildings. But as the attack intensified, French troops under Jérôme Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother, were drawn in deeper. What began as a diversion became an obsession. By midday, thousands of French soldiers were locked in a vicious, grinding melee within Hougoumant's walls. The defenders fought with extraordinary tenacity. Musket fire echoed through narrow corridors. Bayonets flashed in stairwells. Fire consumed the chateau's upper floors. And then came the moment that passed into legend. A small French force breached the main gate, only for a handful of British guards to slam it shut behind them, trapping and cutting down the invaders in brutal close combat. What was meant to be a feint had become a furnace, consuming French strength. Napoleon, perhaps distracted by this unexpected resistance, shifted his focus elsewhere. By around 1 p.m., he unleashed his grand battery, 80 guns massed in the center, on Wellington's Ridge. The earth trembled. The air turned to smoke and flame. Thunderous volleys pounded the Allied positions for nearly an hour, aiming to soften the center for the coming assault. But Wellington's defensive tactics blunted the effect. Most of his troops were deployed behind the crest, not on top of it. The French cannonballs tore up the front of the ridge, but many overshot their mark. Still, the psychological pressure was immense. Shells screamed overhead. Wounded men screamed below, yet the line held. By mid-afternoon, the real test began. Napoleon ordered General d'Erlon's Y Corps, 20,000 strong, to attack the Allied center-left. 4 heavy columns began their march uphill, across muddy fields, towards the waiting redcoats. Their formation, dense and deep, was meant to punch through with raw mass and momentum, but the British infantry was ready. Hidden behind the crest, the thin red lines rose at the last moment and fired in disciplined volleys. The French columns, packed shoulder to shoulder, reeled under the hail of musket balls. At the same time, British heavy cavalry, the Household Brigade and the Union Brigade, charged downhill into their flanks. Horses crashed into men. Sabers tore through ranks. The result was chaos. French formations collapsed under pressure. d'Erlon's assault broke. But the British cavalry, in their elation, pushed too far. They chased retreating infantry across the field, only to run straight into the waiting lances of French cuirassiers, who counterattacked and cut them down. What began as a triumph for Wellington quickly became a mutual slaughter. Across the battlefield, the same pattern repeated. Charge, countercharge, exhaustion. Hougoumont still burned. La Haie-Sainte, another key farmhouse in the center, was now under increasing pressure. The guns fired on. Bodies piled in ditches and hedgerows. Horses screamed. Flags fell. The air was thick with acrid smoke, and the sickly smell of blood and damp powder. And yet, neither side broke. Napoleon had seen many armies break. He had broken them himself at Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram. But here, in the muddy fields of Waterloo, the enemy refused to fold. Wellington's line was battered, but intact. The French attacks were brave, but lacked coordination. The delay caused by Hougoumont had begun a subtle chain reaction, forcing Napoleon to fight on Wellington's terms, not his own. And then came a whisper on the wind. Faint at first, but growing louder. The Prussians were coming, not yet on the field, but moving, marching. The storm Napoleon had hoped to avoid was beginning to close in. By mid-afternoon, the battlefield had become a vision of exhaustion. Smoke hung in the air like a curtain, masking movement and distorting time. The constant rhythm of cannon fire gave way to a more erratic chaos. Bursts of musketry, clashing steel, galloping hooves, and the rising moans of the wounded. The rain was long gone, but the blood had only just begun to flow. Napoleon had thrown his punches. At Hougoumont, at Wellington's left, at the very center of the ridge. And yet the line did not buckle. It bent, sagged, reeled, but it did not shatter. And now a new focal point emerged. The small farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte, located at the base of Wellington's central position. It wasn't just a tactical landmark. It was the gateway to the ridge. Held by the King's German Legion, a veteran unit of Hanoverian exiles fighting under the British flag, La Haye-Sainte had been fortified but not fully resupplied. For hours, its defenders had repelled repeated French assaults with disciplined musket fire from behind stone walls and through shattered windows. But they were running out of ammunition and time. Napoleon, sensing an opportunity, ordered a concentrated assault. Led by Marshal Ney, the French surged forward with renewed ferocity. Ney was a lion on the battlefield, brave to a fault, aggressive, and relentless. His cavalry had already launched earlier attacks that faltered without infantry support. Now, he hoped to seize La Haye-Sainte and pour infantry through the gap. Around 6 p.m., the defenders finally crumbled. Their powder spent, the men of the King's German Legion were forced to abandon the farmhouse. The French flooded in. La Haye-Sainte fell, and with it, the center of Wellington's position was now exposed to direct assault. For the first time in the day, Napoleon could realistically see the possibility of rupturing the Allied line. The timing could not have been more urgent, because just as the French raised their tricolor over La Haye-Sainte, a dark shape began to stir in the eastern distance. It was not a mirage. It was not rumor. It was not the echo of hoofbeats. The Prussians were arriving. Blücher had kept his word. After their defeat at Ligny 2 days earlier, the Prussians had retreated, but not scattered. Reorganizing swiftly, they marched through the mud-soaked backroads of Belgium, determined to rejoin the battle. Now, as the sun began its descent, the vanguard of General von Bülow's 4 Corps appeared near the village of Plancenoit, on Napoleon's right flank. This changed everything. Wellington, who had been clinging to the ridge with sheer stubbornness and iron discipline, now had hope. The arrival of Blücher's forces meant the pressure could shift. Time, which had once favored Napoleon, was now turning against him. But the Prussians were not yet fully deployed, and Napoleon understood this. If he could deliver a knockout blow to Wellington before Blücher's men arrived in force, he might still claim victory. He ordered Ney to exploit the capture of La Haye-Sainte and press the attack on the center. But Ney, ever impetuous and now operating without clear coordination, believed the moment had come for a full assault. He ordered a massive cavalry charge. More than 5,000 cuirassiers and lancers thundered up the slope toward Wellington's ridge, without infantry and without proper artillery support. It was one of the most dramatic, but also most misguided actions of the day. The British infantry, seasoned by years of warfare in Spain, formed squares, tight formations bristling with bayonets, impervious to cavalry unless broken first by fire. The French horsemen circled, charged, regrouped, and charged again, over and over, throwing themselves against immovable walls of men. The visual spectacle was breathtaking. The tactical result was disastrous. Dozens of charges yielded minimal gains and horrendous losses. Horses collapsed in droves. Riders were cut down at close range. And as the French cavalry withdrew, the British lines reformed, damaged but unbroken. At the same time, Napoleon faced a new emergency on his right. The Prussians had reached Plancenoit. To his credit, Napoleon reacted quickly. He dispatched the Young Guard, his best reserve troops, to hold the village. A brutal house-to-house fight began as French grenadiers and Prussian musketeers clashed among churchyards and alleyways. Plancenoit changed hands multiple times. It was no longer just a flank. It was the crumbling edge of Napoleon's entire position. Now he was fighting on two fronts, Wellington to the north, Blucher to the east. His plan to defeat them separately had collapsed. And still, he had one final card: the Old Guard. Veterans of a dozen campaigns, symbols of imperial might, unshaken in the face of disaster. Napoleon had not yet committed them, but the moment was rapidly approaching when he would have no choice. As the sun dipped lower into the haze of cannon smoke and ash, the field of Waterloo had become a graveyard in waiting. Thousands lay wounded or dying. The grass was churned to mud, soaked in blood, trampled by boots, hooves, and the grinding wheels of gun carriages. The air itself was thick with the ghosts of battle, choking, acrid, and still. The center of Wellington's position, barely holding, had been gouged open by the loss of La Haye Saint. Ney, still atop a bloodied horse after having several shot from under him, pushed forward what infantry he had. But it was too little, too late. His unsupported cavalry charges had wasted precious reserves. French infantry advanced piecemeal, without the coordination or mass needed to drive a decisive wedge through the British line. At the same time, the Prussians were now arriving in force. Blucher, bruised but not broken, committed more troops into the fight around Plancenoit. The village, already scarred from earlier fighting, became the focal point of a vicious, grinding contest. Street by street, house by house, Prussian muskets barked from windows as French grenadiers counterattacked with bayonets and grenades. Napoleon responded by sending the Imperial Guard's middle division to reinforce the position, momentarily driving the Prussians back. But it was a rearguard action, delaying, not reversing. Every battalion sent east was one less to strike north. The battlefield was closing in, like a tightening vice. Napoleon stood at a crossroads. His marshals were exhausted, their units depleted. Ney, the bravest of the brave, had fought like a man possessed, but had lost all cohesion. Riley's corps was bleeding out at Hougoumont. D'Erlon's was scattered from its failed assaults. Grouchy, still trailing the Prussians, was nowhere near the battlefield. Napoleon could no longer win by maneuver, only by shock. And so, around 7:30 p.m., he played his last card. The Old Guard, his most elite formation, the men who had carried him through Austerlitz, Eylau, and Wagram, were summoned. Dressed in bearskin hats, brass buttons polished, they were more than soldiers. They were a symbol of imperial invincibility. They had never broken in battle, never routed. Their advance alone could terrify lesser armies into flight. Now they would march uphill, toward Wellington's Ridge, in one final attack. Napoleon did not lead them personally. He remained near his headquarters, coordinating what little he could. The Guard moved forward under the command of General Friant, preceded by a thunderous barrage from the French artillery, what remained of it. The Allies watched in silence as the dark columns ascended. Wellington, sensing the gravity of the moment, repositioned his units. British brigades under Maitland and Adam were hidden behind the ridge, waiting for the Guard to come within range. Silence returned for a moment, an eerie calm before the fury. And then, at the perfect distance, the ridge exploded with musket fire. Thousands of rifles lit the sky as disciplined volleys tore through the advancing Guard. The French staggered, regrouped, and pressed forward. But the fire did not stop. Flanking fire from the 52nd Foot, a British light infantry regiment under Sir John Colborne, struck the Guard's right. It was too much. For the first time, the Old Guard began to falter. They tried to rally. Officers bellowed, drums beat, standards waved high. But the momentum was gone. As they pulled back, not running, but retreating, word spread down the French line like a plague. The Guard is retreating. That simple phrase was a death sentence. The French army, already on the edge, began to unravel. Morale collapsed. Units that had fought tenaciously for hours now broke apart. Some fled. Others threw down their arms. Even seasoned veterans, seeing the Guard withdraw, understood. The battle was lost. Napoleon, for a moment, stood still. His final gamble, the foundation of his legend, had failed not through cowardice, but through tenacity on the part of his enemies. Wellington had held, Blücher had arrived, and the once unbeatable French emperor was watching his army dissolve before him. The retreat turned into a rout. The Prussians surged forward from Plancenoit, overwhelming the right flank. Wellington's troops descended from the ridge, pursuing broken units. The battlefield turned chaotic once more, but now in only one direction. The Grande Armée was in collapse, and then came the final iconic moment. A square of the Old Guard, surrounded near the inn of La Belle Alliance, refused to surrender. When asked by the Prussians to lay down arms, legend says one of their officers replied, "La garde meurt, mais ne se rend pas." The Guard dies but does not surrender. They were annihilated, not because it would change the outcome, but because they were the last flicker of the Empire's pride. Night fell slowly over Waterloo, but the chaos refused to fade. The battlefield that just hours earlier had echoed with the roar of cannon and the cries of charging men now sat under a pall of smoke and silence. Here and there, muffled groans broke the stillness, wounded men calling out for comrades, for water, for mercy. Some lay buried under horses, others slumped in shallow ditches, too weak to move, too numb to feel pain. The once great Grande Armée had ceased to exist. It had not been defeated in a sudden blow, but bled out through attrition, disarray, and mounting despair. The withdrawal that began with the fall of the Old Guard turned into a chaotic retreat, then a rout. Soldiers discarded weapons and uniforms to blend in with the countryside. Artillery teams abandoned their pieces. Officers were cut off from their men, some trying desperately to restore order, others simply fleeing. Napoleon's immediate entourage tried to maintain composure, but the mood was unmistakable. The emperor had lost. At around 9 p.m., Napoleon left the field, heading south toward Charleroi. He was accompanied by a small guard and aides-de-camp, their silence more damning than any reprimand. For the second time in just over a year, Napoleon would be forced to abdicate, but this time there would be no Elba, no return, no miracle. The French marshals were divided. Some still admired him. Others, like Marshal Soult and Marshal Grouchy, who never reached the battlefield, understood the scale of the disaster. Grouchy would later attempt to regroup a portion of the army and fall back toward Paris, but the moment had passed. The defeat at Waterloo was not just a military failure, it was a collapse of legitimacy. France no longer wanted war. The people were weary of sacrifice, the economy strained, and the political climate unstable. Napoleon's brief return, the 100 Days, had promised glory, but delivered ruin. His fate was sealed not by cannonballs, but by exhaustion, France's, Europe's, and his own. Meanwhile, on the ridge overlooking the battlefield, Wellington surveyed the carnage with solemn eyes. He was no stranger to war, but even he would later confess that Waterloo was the most terrible battle he had ever witnessed. Next to a battle lost, he wrote, "The greatest misery is a battle gained." The casualties were staggering. Of Napoleon's 70,000 troops, at least 25,000 were killed or wounded, and another 8,000 captured. Thousands more deserted. The Anglo-Allied army under Wellington lost around 15,000 men, while the Prussians suffered approximately 7,000. By the standards of the time, it was catastrophic, one of the bloodiest single-day battles in European history. The battlefield itself was transformed into a landscape of devastation. Horses, broken wagons, smashed cannons, and bodies lay in heaps across the fields. Local villagers emerged at dawn, scavenging for loot, helping the wounded and burying the dead. The air stank of gunpowder and decay. Yet even in this wasteland, symbolism emerged. At La Belle Alliance, the inn near where the Old Guard made their final stand, Blücher and Wellington met and shook hands. It was a small, almost unceremonious gesture, but it marked the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Two old enemies, now allies, stood not just over a battlefield, but over the threshold of a new Europe. Napoleon's dream had ended, not with a bang of glory, but in mud, smoke, and futility. In the coming days, he would attempt once more to rally the French political class. He offered to continue the fight, to reorganize the army, to negotiate peace, but no one answered. The Chamber of Deputies refused his leadership. His former allies vanished. On June 22nd, just 4 days after Waterloo, Napoleon abdicated again, this time for good. He would surrender to the British and be exiled once more, this time to the remote Atlantic island of St. Helena, far from Europe, far from France, far from the empire he had once ruled. The world had changed, not overnight, not because of one battle, but Waterloo was the symbol, the punctuation mark at the end of a decade of revolution and war. It marked not just the fall of a man, but the fall of a myth. In the days following Waterloo, as smoke cleared from the battlefield, and Napoleon boarded a British vessel bound for exile, a new kind of battle began. One fought not with muskets or sabers, but with pens, treaties, and political will. The monarchs and ministers of Europe had spent the last decade struggling to contain the man who once crowned himself emperor. Now, with that man gone, they were left with a different kind of challenge. What comes after Napoleon? The end of the Napoleonic Wars did not merely signal the conclusion of military conflict. It set the stage for a political reconstruction of the continent on a scale not seen since the fall of the Roman Empire. At the center of that effort stood the Congress of Vienna, a diplomatic summit that had been convened months earlier to shape a post-war order. But Napoleon's return during the 100 Days had disrupted the process. Now, with Waterloo, the world had clarity and urgency. The victors were clear: Great Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, the so-called Quadruple Alliance. Each had sacrificed blood and treasure to defeat France. Each had its own ambitions. Britain, represented by Lord Castlereagh, sought balance, a Europe stable enough to prevent another war, but not so dominated by any one power that Britain's interests would be threatened. Austria, led by the cunning diplomat Clemens von Metternich, wanted to restore the old dynastic order and crush revolutionary movements. Prussia hungered for territorial gains and prestige. Russia's Tsar Alexander I saw himself as a divine instrument of peace, yet harbored imperial ambitions of his own. France, once the epicenter of European transformation, was reduced to a pariah. Louis XVIII, the restored Bourbon king, was reinstated under strict Allied supervision. French borders were rolled back to their 1790 lines. Occupation forces entered Paris. Indemnities were levied. Napoleon's reforms, legal, administrative, educational, remained in part, but the political dynamism of the Republic and Empire was gone. In its place stood a monarchy propped up by foreign bayonets. Europe's map was redrawn. Prussia gained territory in the Rhineland and Saxony, consolidating its influence in the German-speaking world. Austria reasserted control over northern Italy and Central Europe. Russia expanded into Poland. Britain solidified its control of key colonial holdings, especially naval bases and trade routes, reinforcing its growing maritime supremacy. And most significantly, the Holy Alliance was formed, a loose coalition of conservative monarchies aimed at preserving the status quo and suppressing liberal or nationalist revolts. It was a victory not just over Napoleon, but over the spirit of 1789. Yet even as the great powers celebrated, a deeper question lingered beneath the surface. Could this new order truly endure? The continent was weary, economies had been devastated, millions had perished. But beneath the apparent calm, new ideologies were simmering. Liberalism, nationalism, socialism. The seeds of revolution had been planted in the Napoleonic era, and they would not remain dormant for long. Ironically, many of these ideas had been spread by Napoleon himself. As his armies marched across Europe, they had brought with them the Napoleonic Code, meritocratic principles, and a challenge to aristocratic privilege. Even in defeat, the emperor's legacy remained embedded in the institutions he had touched. And there was one more legacy, harder to define, but no less potent: the myth of Napoleon. Already, among veterans, students, and young dreamers across Europe, stories of Waterloo were being reshaped. Napoleon was no longer just the defeated tyrant. In some circles, he became a martyr, a man undone not by his own ambition, but by the jealousy of kings. His downfall was reimagined as noble, tragic, even inevitable. Paintings depicted the valiant old guard standing to the last man. Memoirs poured out from soldiers and generals. Newspapers across Europe debated what might have happened if Grouchy had marched to the battlefield, or if Ney had coordinated better, or if the mud had dried faster. Waterloo, in short, became more than a battle. It became a story, one that would be told, retold, and reshaped for generations. And in that story, every nation found a version of itself. For Britain, it was a tale of steadfastness and discipline. For Prussia, of rebirth and resilience. For France, of tragic glory, and the sting of missed destiny. The physical cost of Waterloo had been staggering, but the psychological cost, the transformation of Europe's identity and memory, was only beginning. A battle ends, soldiers die, the smoke clears, and then the wars pass to history. But some battles refuse to stay buried. Some moments, like Waterloo, rise above their own carnage and become something else. A legend, a metaphor, a mirror for every nation that remembers them. In the immediate aftermath of June 1815, Europe began the process of physical reconstruction. Fields were cleared, bones buried, villages rebuilt. But the emotional reconstruction, the storytelling, had already begun before the last musket was fired. For Britain, Waterloo became a symbol of disciplined courage under pressure. Wellington's army, composed of British, Dutch, Belgian, and German units, was cast in the British press as a model of resilience and unity. The Duke himself became a national icon. His reserved, matter-of-fact demeanor lent itself to hero worship in the Victorian era. Statues were raised, streets named. The very word Waterloo was etched into the British identity as shorthand for hard-earned triumph. Prussia, too, found in Waterloo a moment of vindication. For years, it had suffered defeats and humiliation at Napoleon's hands. But now, with Blücher's timely intervention, Prussia positioned itself not just as a victorious power, but as a central player in European affairs. The battle became part of a broader nationalist awakening that would, decades later, fuel the unification of Germany. For France, the legacy was more complicated. Waterloo was a defeat, but a defeat wrapped in glory. The image of the old guard, refusing to break, became iconic. French painters immortalized the moment. Writers romanticized the battle as a tragedy of genius overcome by numbers and fate. Napoleon himself, writing from exile, reshaped the narrative into one of near-miss destiny, a campaign lost not through fault, but through betrayal and misfortune. And so began the cult of Napoleon, a paradoxical blend of reverence and regret. In France, even among his enemies, Napoleon retained a kind of awe. Over time, his image softened. From tyrant and warmonger to misunderstood reformer, tragic hero, even revolutionary martyr. Waterloo, ironically, made him immortal. But the myth wasn't just national, it was global. Across the 19th century, military academies from West Point to St. Cyr pored over the battle's details. Its formations, its timing, its failures, every aspect was dissected. The terrain of Waterloo became a case study in generalship and logistics. Clausewitz wrote about it. So did Jomini. It became a benchmark against which future generals would be measured. And the word Waterloo itself entered language. It became shorthand for a final reckoning, a moment of unavoidable defeat, a decisive confrontation that defined one's fate. Politicians would have their Waterloo moments. Businesses would collapse in their own Waterloo. The name ceased to be just a place. It became an idea, Monuments reinforced this transformation. In Belgium, the Lion's Mound was constructed, a massive artificial hill crowned with a lion statue built on the orders of the Dutch king. It offered panoramic views of the battlefield, but also altered the land itself, bearing part of the ridges where Wellington's men had fought. Many veterans despised it, not just for the disruption to sacred ground, but for the sanitized memory it represented. Elsewhere, Waterloo was commemorated in poems, songs, and even stage plays. Balzac, Hugo, Byron, they all referenced it. Artists painted the carnage with theatrical flair. Romanticism blended with realism, and history slipped into mythology. But beneath all this, something more human stirred. Waterloo became a shared trauma for Europe, an event remembered not just in monuments, but in families, journals, and silence. Thousands of mothers never saw their sons again. Veterans, even victorious ones, bore the scars, visible and invisible, for life. The battle haunted them. Some would revisit the site years later, staring at the fields that had once been painted red. And then came the wars of the 20th century. As Europe plunged into even greater horrors, Waterloo began to seem almost quaint by comparison. The cavalry charges, the smoke of musketry, the flags and drums, these were relics of a more romantic kind of warfare. But the memory of Waterloo remained, stubborn and sharp. It was a reminder of how even the greatest ambitions could crumble in a single day. In time, the village of Waterloo evolved into a destination, not just for tourists, but for pilgrims of memory. Museums, reenactments, scholarly conferences. The past refused to fade. And in that landscape, the myth of the battle endures. Not because it was the bloodiest, not because it was the largest, but because in that narrow window of time, on a muddy ridge in Belgium, the fate of empires, ideologies, and individuals collided, and the shockwave never quite stopped. When Napoleon Bonaparte died on the remote island of St. Helena in 1821, far from the boulevards of Paris or the glory of Austerlitz, the world paused, but did not forget. His empire was gone. His armies were scattered. His dream of a unified Europe under French leadership lay buried in the Belgian mud. And yet, his legend was only beginning. For many, Napoleon remained the archetype of the modern ruler, brilliant, flawed, dynamic, and dangerous. He had overthrown monarchs, redrawn borders, rewritten legal codes. His fall at Waterloo did not erase these achievements. It amplified them, casting them in a new, tragic light. The image of a man who nearly ruled a continent, only to be undone by his own ambition, proved irresistible to poets, revolutionaries, and rulers alike. In France, the post-Waterloo period was fraught with tension. The Bourbon monarchy returned, draped in foreign protection and domestic uncertainty, but it struggled to command loyalty. Veterans of Napoleon's campaigns, now civilians, told stories of loyalty and greatness. They wore old medals in secret, whispered names of fallen comrades, and waited. By 1840, the French government, under King Louis-Philippe, officially repatriated Napoleon's remains from St. Helena to Paris in an event known as the Retour des Cendres, Return of the Ashes. His body was interred beneath the Golden Dome of Les Invalides, where it remains to this day, a monument not only to the man, but to France's complicated relationship with him. Waterloo had not ended Napoleon's influence. It had immortalized it. In the 19th century, as empires expanded and nationalism took root, Napoleon's model spread. He had demonstrated how a single leader with vision and audacity could remake the world order. Figures from Bismarck to Lenin, from Garibaldi to de Gaulle, studied his tactics, not just on the battlefield, but in governance, propaganda, and legacy building. Even his enemies could not ignore him. Wellington, in his later years, spoke of Napoleon with a mixture of admiration and regret. His presence on the battlefield, he once said, was worth 40,000 men. For the British, defeating him became a cornerstone of national pride, but understanding him became a kind of obsession. Biographies, studies, critiques, the name Napoleon never faded from their intellectual and military discourse. Beyond Europe, the legend grew. In the United States, Napoleon fascinated the public imagination. He had sold the Louisiana Territory to Jefferson, reshaped Europe, and stood as a symbol, either of Republican virtue gone awry, or of tyranny cloaked in charisma. Andrew Jackson, America's own military populist hero, was often likened to the Corsican. Even Abraham Lincoln was known to read books about Napoleon's campaigns by candlelight. Across Latin America, revolutionaries like Simón Bolívar admired Napoleon's energy and boldness while consciously avoiding his authoritarian tendencies. In Asia, particularly in Meiji-era Japan, military scholars studied Napoleonic warfare as they modernized their own armed forces. In Russia, czars both feared and respected his legacy. Despite the devastation of his 1812 invasion, Napoleon had inadvertently exposed weaknesses in Russia's feudal system, prompting slow but eventual reform. His image became a double-edged sword, both a symbol of foreign danger and a model for modernization. And so, Waterloo, far from ending the Napoleonic chapter, simply gave it a final act, one that would echo across continents and generations. Military academies taught his campaigns. Political theorists dissected his rise and fall. Historians debated his morality, his methods, his madness. Some painted him as a megalomaniac who trampled freedom under his boot. Others saw in him a flawed genius, a man of the Enlightenment caught in the storm of his own ambition. The truth, as always, lived somewhere between the extremes. What cannot be denied is this: the world after Waterloo was not the same as before. The systems Napoleon challenged, absolute monarchy, divine right, hereditary privilege, had been permanently shaken. Even in defeat, he forced Europe to adapt, to reform, to modernize. His codes of law lived on, his administrative structures endured. His military doctrines echoed through 2 world wars. His symbolism, of meteoric rise and catastrophic fall, remained a cautionary tale for emperors and ideologues alike. And Waterloo, as the moment when that tale crystallized, became not just a military event, but a universal metaphor, the line between greatness and ruin, between ambition and overreach, between legacy and legend. In the long arc of history, certain names stand alone. Waterloo is one of them. It was not the bloodiest battle in history, nor the most strategically complex. It lasted a single day. Its outcome was clear, its consequences immediate. And yet, it endures, etched not only into the soil of Belgium, but into the collective memory of the world. Why? Because Waterloo was never just a clash of armies. It was a confrontation between eras, between revolution and reaction, between individual ambition and the architecture of empires, between the chaos of change and the desire for order. On that June day in 1815, the battlefield became a crucible for everything that had defined Europe for the past 2 decades. It was the culmination of Napoleon's journey, from outsider to emperor, from lawgiver to warmonger, from savior of the Republic to threat to the world. His fall at Waterloo marked not only the end of a reign, but the collapse of a vision, of a Europe restructured not by kings and councils, but by merit, strategy, and will. And yet, the story isn't that simple. Napoleon did not lose because he lacked genius. In fact, his final campaign was marked by moments of brilliance: the surprise at Ligny, the rapid concentration of forces, the split between Wellington and Blücher. But the emperor's magic, his ability to turn desperate moments into stunning victories, had faded. Age, fatigue, distrust among his marshals, and a Europe finally united against him all played their parts. Waterloo, then, is not a story of failure alone. It is a story of limits, of the boundary between what a single individual can achieve and where history pushes back. It also reminds us of war's unforgiving arithmetic. In the span of 10 hours, tens of thousands were killed, wounded, or maimed. Families across Europe, British, French, German, Dutch, Prussian, would never be the same. The fields of rye and wheat that swayed in the June wind were flattened by cannon fire and soaked in blood. Victory or defeat mattered little to the dead, and yet those who survived returned home and told their stories. They told of the thunder of hooves, of musket balls splitting trees, of drums and banners, and men who stood when everything told them to run. They told of brothers lost, of friendships forged, of a moment when the world seemed to balance on a single ridge, under a sky smeared with fire and rain. Over time, those stories changed. They were mythologized, romanticized, politicized. Napoleon became a symbol. Wellington, a statue. Waterloo itself, a word used to describe not a place, but a turning point, a reckoning. In every century since, leaders have stood in their own Waterloo moments, facing consequences they cannot avoid, enemies they cannot outrun, and outcomes they cannot reshape. The battle lives on because its truths are eternal. The cost of ambition, the fragility of victory, and the burden of command. Today, visitors walk the quiet fields of Waterloo, tracing the lines of battle with maps in hand. The Lion's Mound rises above the ridge, surrounded by museums and markers, but the wind still carries something older than memory, a whisper of drums perhaps, or the echo of hooves. The past does not sleep easily here, and perhaps it shouldn't. Because Waterloo is not just about what happened, it's about what could happen again. When ambition outpaces reason, when coalitions fracture, when we forget that glory is paid for in flesh. In that way, the final lesson of Waterloo is not tactical or political. It is human. It tells us that greatness and downfall often ride in the same carriage, that the future can pivot on the mud of a single field, and that the echo of one cannon, fired centuries ago, can still ring in the decisions we make today. The story of Waterloo ends here, on a ridge in Belgium, where ambition met resistance, and an empire fell into legend. But what do you think? Was Napoleon a visionary undone by fate, or a conqueror brought low by his own overreach? Did Waterloo truly reshape Europe forever, or was it just one chapter in a much older struggle for power? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and tell us what part of this story resonated with you the most. If you enjoyed this journey through history, give the video a like and share it with others who love the past as much as you do. And don't forget to subscribe for more epic historical deep dives. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next campaign.